Tonight's talk, and I think this is just a general theme of the day, deals something very close to home because we are in the heart of San Francisco's gentrification as well as the housing crisis here in the Mission, and that's been historically the case for the last 20 years. If anybody even walking off, some of us came off of BART, and so 24th Street BART, you see some of it still, but coming off from 16th, or even seeing 14th Street this past Sunday, we marched with the Hugo Chavez March, which had about 300 people. And when we started marching back into beyond 16th Street, it's unrecognizable. I mean, the housing complexes that are on Valencia, it's like night and day between Valencia and Mission. So again, it's important to have this conversation because the question is, how do you push back against it? How do you fight it? And how do you build a movement that also raises the awareness of just what that gentrification actually does? The issue of housing is also critical because it's sometimes, and like most liberal politics, presented as solely an economic issue, and it's not a combination of economic, and it should be discussed as economic discrimination and as well as racism, because this is the general approach to San Francisco politics that's considered this very liberal, progressive city, but at the same time, very little gets discussed at just how much racism is really going on when you see gentrification, because it kicks out historic communities and doesn't give them access to what was once their neighborhood. So it's easy for politicians in San Francisco and liberal groups that dominate politics in San Francisco to talk about the importance of business interest as the main priority. So you're always hearing this thing, it's like, well, if business interests don't come, if banks don't lend money, then you don't have any condos going up. So then you have this dilapidated neighborhood. And so once they come in, then you get, these great things, quote unquote, but it isn't really for the people that live there, but it's for a new type of person with different type of resources. And so just to see how this debate is usually held, I do want to present a video. I think we had that up there. It's made by a local newspaper, actually very local. It's in the Mission District. And so it's called Mission Local. And it does a good job at highlighting what is wrong with the approach to the debate about access to affordable housing in San Francisco, or really in any city, because you're going to see it. It's a well-made video, but it just kind of, I'll highlight some things afterwards, but it's definitely deals with what I'm talking about. This is the way things get presented, so there's very like poofed up words like the new frontier, just like the energy that this brings. And I graduated with an architecture degree and a minor in city and regional planning, and you'd always have these discussions, right? Like how you're going to bring in this new development and it's gonna, have a facade of the community but draw in the public space. And it was just like, now you look back at it and it's so, and the thing is that it's never described as what it is, this violence against a community, something that's really tearing a community apart. And so you have this narrative presented as really a personal thing, like different, people just wanting to live in a dynamic community, even they use that word dynamic, rather than a political and economic onslaught, which is true. And it presents both sides without addressing the principle that people should have a right to housing. People should have a right to stay where they work, live where they've lived historically. And it really places, and I think the video does a good job, it places the workers, the petty bourgeoisie, landlords, the bourgeoisie, sort of on this leveled playing field where everyone has equal voice and equal say. And obviously that doesn't exist because the government's not mass subsidizing your labor, giving you work at union wages, and then giving you time off to then go represent yourself at City Hall, but at the same time is giving these huge payroll tax breaks on downtown businesses. If you have your CEO job, they mobilize the media, you got the mayor speaking on your behalf, you have the whole state speaking on your behalf as to why you should, your business here is wanted, right? So it's not really protecting any of the interest of the workers, the ones who actually produce that profit. And so this is really what is disturbing about these type of films, because it presents it as very liberal, but you can see just the reality around here, what that means. And urban gentrification affects cities all across the country, driving up rents while driving out poor and working class residents who are replaced by new residents driving luxury vehicles or being picked up by luxury buses nowadays. Signs of gentrification are well known. Trendy restaurants and clubs appear, leading the neighborhood to, quote, be discovered by well-to-do patrons. Soon, luxury rentals and lofts appear. National chain stores repair mom-and-pop commercial businesses. Neighborhoods that have been neglected for decades receive lavish city services. So you have this, like even the way that said, like, the Tenderloin was considered, you know, ungentrifiable. Like like that's such an assault on the city that people can reside there. And the problem is obviously it's drugs and crime. It's not the poverty that they instilled on people when they just mass placed them in this housing and give them no jobs. So that's not the problem. Few cities, though, have been affected by gentrification more than San Francisco. And again, the Mission District is a prime example of that. Primarily Latino and immigrant community, the Mission has undergone gentrification since the dot-com boom of the 1990s. Ever since the economic collapse of 2008 and was considered the, quote, second tech boom, the gentrification is no longer reserved to the borders of the Mission in areas like 16th Street and by Harrison Street. Like now if you go over by Harrison, it's been this huge industry. But now if you're walking even on 24th Street, and if people have done sort of the postering route with us whenever we go, I mean, half the old Mission locales have been replaced by hip coffee shops and restaurants. And I think the other day I was going with somebody postering, and they even had a tour and they're having this neighborhood tours of the weekend. And I mean, it's just the way you see it. Obviously, the people on that tour do not represent what historically has been in this community. And so the same applies to housing. Home ownership is often touted as, quote, the American dream. But in 2005, the median price of a home in San Francisco rose 16.71% to $847,000. That's the average home. I think that went down for a little while, but then actually has continued rising only because they still keep speculating with the price, making this dream an impossibility for all but the wealthy. This has fueled the trend to sell all of any available property rather than rent it out, squeezing out low-income residents. Today, it costs $2,126 a month on average to rent a studio apartment in San Francisco. $2,126. An increase of 22% since 2008. Again, we need to point out not only to the stunning economic features, we also have to couple it with the equally troubling racism behind gentrification. Starting with the redevelopment of the Fillmore area in the 1960s, San Francisco's African-American population has been dwindling. In 2005, the African-American population had shrunk to 46,779 people, just 6.5% of the city's population. So already a dramatic figure. 6.5%. In 2011, the figure was down to 3.9% in San Francisco. And that's down from 79,039 people, or 12.4% just 25 years ago. And people getting kicked out. And I think usually when you see the headlines in the papers, it's like people, the out migration or people's flight, and it's like it's not really the kicking out of people that they're looking towards, especially in the Bayview. We're talking really what is the Mission, but if you look in the Bayview, it's even worse. I mean, because of the economic collapse, a lot of people actually think it was one of the highest rates of home ownership amongst the black community in the Bayview. And because of the economic collapse, so many people lost so much of their homes. And we can see a similar trend happening to other historic communities where mainly Latinos, Chinese, and Filipinos live. This trend has sharpened due to the rising use of the infamous Ellis Act. And I don't know, explaining a little bit about what the Ellis Act is. It was enacted in 1986. And this state law allows a landlord to stop renting units, evict all tenants, and sell the building for another purpose. Originally construed as a way for landlords to go, quote, out of business and move into their properties, the Ellis Act instead gained notoriety as a driving force behind a wave of evictions that slammed San Francisco during the tech boom of the late 1990s. It was reported in this great cover story of the Bay Area Guardian, actually it was a really great story, it was being passed around last month, that between 1986 and 1985, just 29 Ellis evictions were filed in San Francisco to the San Francisco Rent Board. So almost this period of 9 years, only 29 were filed under the Ellis Act. In 1999 and 2000, the fiscal year alone, that number ballooned to a staggering 440. So in just 1 year, 440. So You could tell the difference. The article goes on to point out that under the current tech heyday, there are indications that Ellis Act evictions are gaining fresh momentums, and that's why we're actually having the conversation here now, because it's really a relevant thing here in San Francisco. The San Francisco Rent Board recorded 81 Ellis Act evictions this past fiscal year, more than double that of the previous year, and there appears to be an upward trend. Ted Gullickson, head of the San Francisco Tenants Union, states that his group has tracked at least 26 buildings where Ellis Act evictions have been filed this year, including 17 in the popular, and see how it's presented, popular Mission District. This is tripling the figures from 2 years ago. He believes most buyers are either seeking to convert the buildings to condos or turn them into vacation rentals. So this has become sort of a vacation hangout. And if you've seen, I think we're going to see a big transformation in the next coming 5 years. The two major buildings that take up almost half the block between 22nd and 21st on Mission have been sold. So the Giant Value, and then the one across the street, which used to be the old theater, that's being renovated and supposed to be like this huge community space that has gyms and restaurants and stuff. So you can see how community that is. The article finally states, when the housing market bounces upward, Ellis Act evictions tend to hit long-term tenants whose monthly payments, protected by rent control, are a comparative bargain. Even if they've submitted every payment on time and upheld every lease obligation for 20 years, these renters can find themselves in a bind of being forced out. And they don't just lose their home, often they lose their community. San Francisco has become so expensive that many Ellis Act victims are tossed out of the city for good. In closing, I want to say that while the principles for which we fight are very clear, we think that dignified and affordable housing should be a right, and that people should have a right to live near the area of their work. It is murkier when we talk about how to fight back, because the violent and racist process of gentrification is meant to divide the working class. Higher paid workers, known as professionals, replace low-wage workers, retired workers, immigrant workers, and workers of color. And then higher paid workers are then told that their interests lie in the process of oppressing instead of standing in solidarity with their fellow workers. They ask for more cops, for laws like sit and lie, stop and frisk, and the requirement of expensive permits in order to prevent street vendors from barely making a living. So this causes a reaction, a justifiable yet blinding reaction by the most oppressed, who are then hostile to hipsters, yuppies, and gentrifiers. But in that whole process, the ones who continue to benefit are the banks, the landlords, the realtors, and, in other words, the 1%. As socialists, the PSL acknowledges the importance of reforms that demand not only keeping people in their homes, but also demanding affordable housing for all as a way of uniting workers against the real enemies, and really whose assets we must seize in order to genuinely solve the problem of housing. So seizing assets that they took illegally from people when banks were bailed out, and also just to fund people's needs. I end with a quote from Gloria Riva, a longtime resident of the Mission and a member of the PSL who spoke on the issue of gentrification at a recent police brutality march. Quote, "We are so fed up with seeing the cops pull young people off the bus because they don't have any money and putting them in handcuffs. I've lived in the Mission for 32 years. This place is ours. The rents are now $2,700 a month. And there are a whole lot of people who I see getting off the BART now who I've never seen before, and they can pay that rent. And I want to tell them, you know, you can move here, but you got to take our side. You can't just go to those expensive restaurants and ignore the rest of us. You've got to stand for us too."